Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Rosie.
How are you doing, Rosie?
Well, I'm excited because we're going camping tomorrow. So...
Not just camping.
Blind camping.
Mystery road trip is what we've decided to call it. And yeah, it's going to be an adventure.
Yeah, we're just going to
We don't know what to expect.
But we have stuff and supplies that we are not completely done getting yet.
Well, we're planning on camping out of our car and just seeing what we come across as we drive around Wisconsin.
What a wild adventure it will be.
I know. It's kind of a pandemic-style fall vacation. So, anyway, that's what we have going on later this week. Also, we have a Patreon episode coming out alongside this one.
Yes, we do.
That is a video where we talk about some scams that have come up in the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, a lot of scams lately.
Scams that I've personally experienced that I'm like, what? They do this now? Anyway, it should be interesting. Before we get into the story, Rosie, do you want to read the 5-star review?
Sure. It's entitled Dedicated Listener. It says...
Looks like Burrito got a hold of this outline somehow. There's like 1,000 sixes before
Yeah,
it.
I noticed that. The review says, I absolutely love this podcast. Your personalities shine through, your interactions between each other, and fan communication is great. You are both so genuine and sweet. Content is amazing, and you do a great job at presenting it. I am glad I have some episodes to catch up on, but keep them coming. It's from Steffi G 2020.
Thank you so much, Steffi G.
Super cute.
That's awesome. Well, this is part 2 of the Timothy Jones case of Nahtahn, Merah, Elias, Gabriel, and Abigail-Elaine Jones. So if you haven't heard episode 120 yet, that's part 1 of the story. When we left off, Timothy Jones Jr. had been arrested and confessed to killing his 5 children. So in this trial, being in South Carolina, the death penalty was on the table. And we're going to go over some of the thoughts from the family on this and then some other details later on. So, you ready, Rosie?
To start, Tim's grandmother, Roberta Thornsberry, had taken the stand at trial, and she sobbed on the stand after she was asked if she thought that Tim should be put to death.
So, we're going to just play the audio of her response because it's so heavy, and I think it's important to hear it in order to try and understand the pain that she's in. This is Roberta Thornsberry, who we find out kind of raised Tim. And so we're going to hear from a couple different people in this episode, but she's the first one here. She was asked how she felt about Tim being put to death, which is, if he's found guilty, I mean, that's the sentence.
Right.
You want Tim Jr. put to death?
No, God, no. I love him. Our family's been through enough. I just don't think we can take anymore. This has broke us so bad. And that, I think, would just be the final nail in the coffin. I just don't think I can take anymore.
You still love Tim?
Oh, God, I love him with all my heart. I don't think when you love someone, it ever goes away.
So obviously, you can hear the intense trauma Roberta's going through here. I mean, this whole situation had to be so shocking to her.
Right.
And life-altering.
Right. Well, it just makes it more emotional when you think of the family of Tim. Like, it's so easy to be like, oh, he's guilty and he needs to have the worst punishment. But when then you hear the family's side and their emotions.
And again, his crime was against them, too, because, I mean, it's their grandchildren.
Right.
But obviously there's a little bias because it is basically Tim's mom. And it's just one side of it.
Yeah. Timothy Jones Sr., the father of the murderer, also took the stand. He talked about the history of mental illness in his family, saying, "This is the Tim that I was scared I was going to see one day." He talked about how Timothy's mother and many of her siblings struggled with mental illness, one of which had taken his own life. When he was asked to describe what it's like losing his grandchildren, he said he's been living in hell and can't sleep. But he crumbled emotionally and said, "I don't know how to explain it." He said he had to have the pool removed from his backyard because he couldn't handle looking at it and remembering the good times he had with the kids. He even showed the court a tattoo on his back of the 5 kids, showing his devotion to them.
So it's obvious that this action by his son completely destroyed his life. He was another victim of this crime.
After showing how much this act devastated him, he was also asked if he wanted his grandchildren's murderer put to death. We'll play the audio of his response as well.
You want Tim to be put to death?
No, sir. I don't, I love him so much, I don't want to hurt him more. I mean, hell, I've hurt enough. I mean, it's destroyed my family. So no, you don't like him?
Do you struggle with guilt?
Every day.
And I want you to know that I'm not suggesting
I know.
there's no guilt for the babies.
Yes, and my son, for that matter. I mean, it's more for the babies, though.
So now we've heard from Tim's father and grandma. So, unavoidable bias in their feelings on the matter. But, I still wanted to play their responses because it's so... You don't usually look at that side, that perspective.
Right.
And I thought since it's there, it'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, I appreciate that you put that in.
But in my opinion, what matters most are the feelings of the mother of the children who were brutally taken from her. So
Amber was asked the same question as Roberta, and we're going to play the audio from what she said so that you can hear it.
I hear what my kids went through and what they endured. Sorry. And as a mother, if I could personally rip his face off, I would. That's the mom in me. That's the mama bear in me, wanting to just make him feel everything they felt. I don't personally feel like I have the right to put anybody's life in my hands. I don't wish that upon anybody. I don't wish the Jones family to feel what I felt losing my sons. I do not wish to... I will never have my grandbabies. I will never have those things. They'll never get to see anything more of them. I'm trying to, I guess, take a step back and trying to put myself in everybody's shoes because it has affected a lot more than just myself. It's even affected you guys. And you're just getting to know them. There's so much more about them. It's affected more than just me. I pray for Tim all the time. I pray for him often. I pray for his family often. I pray for my family. They didn't even have the opportunity to know them. I can't bring myself to want anybody to die. That's something that I say because I have to be okay with what I say on this stand. This is something I have to live with. There's been a lot of loss on both sides of our families. Since my kids have died, I have lost 11 family members, if you include my children, within the past 5 years. One being an aunt that died the first day trials started of kidney failure. I've had many, many losses in pregnancy. I had 8 babies altogether with Tim. 8. I had 5 healthy, 2 miscarriages, and a stillborn daughter, and now I have none of them. That's a lot of loss for a mother to feel. So I do sympathize with Miss Roberta. I do. I think her and I connected on that when I was involved in the Jones family.
You want mercy?
I do. And I don't say it lightly. He did not show my children mercy by any means. But my kids loved him. And if I'm speaking on behalf of my kids and not myself, that's what I would have to say. I'm not here for me. The mom in me just wants him to feel it. Everything that I feel, that my kids felt. Nothing justifies what you've done. There's nothing you could possibly say that would justify what you've done to my babies. But they loved you. I loved you. I thought if we could reach a point to make things work for our children that we could. And then we'd argue again. And I'd say, there's the Tim that I can't be with. It wasn't a game. It was a legitimate back and forth, a fight emotionally. I hope for mercy for you. I pray for you often. And I say that without excusing what he's done. I say that wholeheartedly from the depths of my soul. I don't want anyone to feel anymore. There's been so much loss. A lot of loss.
So, what did you think of that?
Wow. I mean, I feel like she's thinking very level-headed with this situation. I feel like I would have a lot more anger.
Yeah, me too.
For the whole situation and what she's going through. She seems so humble and understanding.
Yeah, like she's looking at the whole picture.
Yeah.
And she sympathized for Roberta, who we heard from earlier.
She was very gracious with the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's the mother of the children, the most impacted living victim of this crime.
Mm-hmm.
And she asked for mercy. She didn't want Tim to get sentenced to death.
And I wouldn't have blamed her if she wanted him sentenced to death.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I kind of feel
that's
like
the natural response.
he should be.
Yeah.
Personally, if I was in that situation, I would have been like, yes, please.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you'd think anyone would. Again, this trial was like 5 years after the actual crime, so she had a lot of time to process her grief and get counseling and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But after all of this, at the end of the trial, Rosie, what happened?
After less than 2 hours of deliberation on June 11th, 2018, the jury found him guilty of all charges and sentenced him to death.
Mm-hmm. So, despite the mother of the murdered children asking for leniency and mercy, the decision was made. And this is a very emotionally charged situation because what this man did was such a heartless and monstrous atrocity. Like you just said, you would have wanted him. You wouldn't have wanted mercy for someone who did this, what we talked about last week. I can't imagine anything worse than murdering your children. But it does make me wonder who they're getting justice for here.
Right.
If the mother of the children asks for mercy, isn't she the one whose opinion really matters? I think it should be the most important, but...
That is really strange to me, too.
Yeah. But let's talk a bit about Timothy's life growing up, according to the testimony of a social worker named Deborah Gray.
Well, she completed a psychosocial history report on Timothy James Jr., which, according to Wikipedia, is, quote, an approach that looks at individuals in the context of the combined influence that psychological factors and the surrounding social environment have on their physical and mental wellness and their ability to function.
So basically, trying to look at the full picture of someone's life and the influences around it, not to try to justify their wrong actions, but to try to understand what went wrong in the making of this person, basically.
Timothy Jones' history began with his grandmother, Roberta Thornsberry, whom we already had heard from. She had been his default mother after his parents split and his father gained full custody of him.
Now we need to go back even further than that to when Roberta was only 3 years old.
Roberta had spent time living in an orphanage at 3 years old after her parents split, even though her mom was still alive.
And I couldn't figure out if her parents got a divorce or if her father died or what happened, but she was left at an orphanage.
Her mother got remarried during that time and eventually came and took her daughter back. But Roberta's stepfather was a monster. When she was 8 years old, he started physically and sexually abusing her, both beating and raping her. She became pregnant for the first time at age 11 by her stepfather. This same year, he took her away from her mother and continued to rape and abuse her. He got her pregnant 2 more times at ages 14 and 16.
So, just to stop for a second there, this is the first person we heard from in this episode who, she says she can't take any more trauma.
Right. Well, now it's very...
Yeah.
You can understand why she would say something like that.
This gives background to what she's lived through.
One of these children that she was pregnant with was Timothy Jones Sr., the father of Timothy Jones Jr. At age 16, Roberta's stepfather forced her to marry him and began selling her for sex against her will. Oh my gosh, this poor woman.
Yeah.
What else could she possibly have going in her life?
It was an absolutely awful childhood, but thankfully she was able to escape her abuser eventually with her 3 children and actually fled across the country.
She moved in with a man named Larry Thornsberry, who eventually became her husband. This is the man Timothy Jones Sr. considered to be his real father, though he wasn't perfect either. Larry dealt with substance abuse, being an alcoholic, and having been busted with both weed and cocaine. He would sometimes go into violent rages in front of both Timothy Jones Sr. and his son Timothy Jones Jr. But apparently, despite this, there was a lot of love and caring, and it's said that Larry did his best to care for the kids, never hurting them directly.
Yeah, so he had some personal issues, but he didn't harm other people or direct them outward,
Mm-hmm.
They were kind of internalized.
Timothy Jones Jr.'s parents met after his father dropped out of school at 16 and married a girl named Cynthia. A year later, they gave birth to Timothy. Cynthia had been a victim of abuse herself, having been molested for the first time at 3 years old, and continually abused by multiple men, including her father, throughout her life.
So, Timothy Jones Jr.'s grandma and biological mom had really messed up childhoods. And Cynthia also had some mental issues that we'll get into, which is what his dad was talking about in the trial.
When Cynthia's son, Timothy Jones Jr., was a baby, she continued the cycle of abuse, leaving him in icy baths, refusing to feed him enough, and leaving him alone in a room with a dirty diaper, screaming to be cleaned and fed. She also gave him laxatives as a baby to, quote, cleanse his soul. Eventually, she left the family and turned to prostitution. Wow, this family has a lot going on.
Yeah, dysfunctional is an understatement. So Cynthia herself, she was a broken woman, and she took her pain out on her own child. So that, that's something that I think it's important to consider here.
Mm-hmm.
It's really sad to see this cycle happening.
Deborah Gray said, "This is a family that has learned to self-medicate because of the pain that they have been through." She said that Timothy Jones Jr.'s father was a drunk while he grew up, beating his stepmother and verbally berating Timothy.
We heard during the clip we played of him, Timothy Jones Sr., they asked if he feels guilt about the kids and about his son. And he said, yeah, he really regrets things like this from his past. And it's really sad now because he seems like a sweet old man after, having a pretty rough start. But apparently, Timothy Jones Jr. was forced into performing oral sex on an older man when he was a child, causing him an immense amount of shame. And I don't know who it was, but I think someone that he grew up around, some adult.
He started talking about hearing voices when he was 12, who were kind at first. He called them his imaginary friends, but eventually they became violent and urged him to take his life. As a teenager, he was in 2 car accidents, both of which caused damage to his right frontal lobe.
So the right frontal lobe is sometimes referred to as the part of the brain which makes us human. Part of its job is judging between good and bad, right and wrong choices. It's basically the conscience. So it's notable that Timothy had injured it twice. And also it kind of sounds like he may have been schizophrenic. He talked about hearing voices. But during trial, the court-appointed psychiatrist who worked with Timothy before the trial said that he was not schizophrenic by what he could tell. So again, that's that's just kind of what Timothy seems to want people to believe.
Okay. Very interesting. While Timothy was in high school, he was arrested at school and escorted out in handcuffs for marijuana possession after he had taken it from his father's stash. But unlike his father, he graduated high school after doing relatively well. He joined the Navy soon after, but was discharged during basic training because he suffered from depression and tried to deal with it by using drugs like cocaine and heroin.
Oof.
After this, he began using alcohol and marijuana often, leading to his arrest. He was incarcerated in Illinois for a time at a prison boot camp. This is when he found religion and made a commitment to make a huge change in his life. When he was 21 years old, he was released from prison and began attending a small Pentecostal church in the Chicago area.
And apparently at this church he would speak in tongues, which is interesting. This led to him telling his grandmother, Roberta, that his 3-year-old niece was possessed, and if his family members didn't join his church, they would all go to hell.
Great preaching method.
Yeah, I'm sure it really got to the heart.
Warm and fuzzies.
Obviously it sounds really extreme, but it did seem like he was trying to turn his life around at this point.
I guess.
Like getting clean, at least, getting off the drugs and turning to religion to try to improve his quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And he took even more steps to do this.
He began attending community college and eventually transferred to Mississippi State and graduated summa cum laude.
Which is an honorary title, which I've never heard of before.
Oh.
But it's given to people who graduated with the highest distinction.
Oh, so he did very well.
Yeah.
When he was 25, members of his family decided to reunite him with his mother.
And this experience was interesting, to say the least.
Cynthia was difficult to communicate with, and at one point, they had found her in the backyard fighting with her mother who had passed away previously. Timothy's half-brother Tyler said she was, quote, crazy as a ball bat. Apparently, she would also cut off her hair and plant it in the garden. That's really weird.
Yeah, there's something going on there.
And seeing things like this scared Timothy, who wondered if he would be like that.
So all of this was according to that psychosocial report that Deborah Gray had completed. But she was accused by the prosecution of tailoring her report in favor of the defense, which could be fair, because a lot of it is talking about all the terrible things Timothy Jones has gone through and then how he tried to turn his life around. But despite that, I still think these things should be considered.
Life is life. Facts are facts.
Yeah, exactly.
She's just writing it down.
And they're considering putting this man to death against the wishes of the mother of the murder victims. So, that is a big thing in my mind. But I'm not about to go to the defense of a child murderer. No matter what his childhood was like, it's still his responsibility to not perpetuate these things onto anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And there's absolutely no justification or excuse for his actions. He should obviously be punished to the full extent of the law. But what I will say is that I feel so bad for his grandmother, Roberta.
Mm-hmm.
Look at everything she's already endured, and then having to live through this trial and deal with this shocking and horrific loss.
Yeah, I feel bad for Roberta, too.
And then she had to take the extra hit of having her grandson, who she basically raised, sentenced to death, even after Amber asked for mercy. So, it just had to be such a hard situation for this whole family. But now we're going to discuss the psychological evaluation done by a psychiatrist named Dr. Richard Fryerson. He also testified during the trial while considering the insanity defense.
Mm-hmm. He made it clear that his testimony was his professional opinion and not meant to advocate for either the prosecution or the defense. According to Dr. Fryerson, Jones told him that he decided to strangle 4 of his children after accidentally killing 6-year-old Nahtahn because he thought it was best if they were just all together. He went on to conclude that Jones knew right from wrong and that his actions were not because of the voices in his head, but because of anxious thoughts running through his head after the first murder.
So basically, he was more likely trying to eliminate witnesses than actually believing that this is what was best for his children. Because in order to qualify as insane when you're in a trial like this, it needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that you did not have control over your actions or you didn't know right from wrong. But, Timothy is able to describe his thought process, and we'll get into more details, but it's pretty obvious he knew he messed up.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Fryerson described Jones's thought process, saying that he realized, "It's a matter of time before I get arrested. I may as well take a trip to Vegas."
Without the kids.
Since he knew he was going to go away, he delusionally felt morally justified, which is much different than not knowing if it's morally wrong.
Again, he was more concerned about himself and enjoying his last moments of freedom than with the well-being of his own children.
Jones tried to justify this by telling the doctor, quote, "I knew I had schizophrenia. I was psychotic. I thought it was better for me to take their lives. I cut off their windpipes, kissed them, and took their lives. I'm not a murderer. I'd rather know where they're at."
I. He's so focused on himself here. It's like everything is just how it's going to affect him. And it's like, I knew I had a mental disorder, so it's okay.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. The doctor said, quote, "He made a decision and a conscious choice to kill them. He felt, in his way, morally justified, which is different from not knowing if it's morally wrong to do so."
So, this contradicts the defense when they argued that Timothy was delusional and schizophrenic and not knowing right from wrong here. And in case what we already said isn't clear enough, we're going to go through other things that really cement, in my mind, the fact that there's no way he should qualify as insane.
Mm-hmm. But although Fryerson could not find any reason to believe that Jones was schizophrenic, he did find that Jones had been using a lot of mind-altering drugs, including the spice they found in his car, which is a synthetic form of cannabis. Jones had been dosing up to 5 times a day around this time, even taking it on his breaks at work. Geez, this guy must have always been blazing.
And with 5 kids, and while he's at work, he's just always lit.
Also, according to credit card records, he had spent $230 on spice in just the last month before the murders.
So based on this info, Fryerson did have a different diagnosis for Jones.
He diagnosed Jones with a substance-induced psychotic disorder from spice, as well as a severe disorder from cannabis and a mild disorder from alcohol abuse. He testified, "I think spice contributed incredibly to what happened by stimulating paranoid thoughts that Jones had about Nahtahn."
Apparently, Jones told the doctor that he had paranoid thoughts that Nahtahn was plotting to kill him in his sleep? A 6-year-old? But the doctor said, if this is true, the spice definitely exacerbated it. Which, yeah, it would.
He went on to flat out tell the court, voluntary use of drugs is not a defense in criminal case.
Yeah. I can't agree more. When you harm other people like this. And on top of all this, there's also all the steps he took to evade the law after the murders.
He had loaded them up and done internet searches on how to hide bodies in landfills and best places to go to avoid extradition to the United States.
So if you're thinking that far ahead, you're not out of control or, not knowing right from wrong.
Right. And again, he had written MB on one of his planned notepads, meaning Mexican border.
Another thing is just the fact that he admitted to the crimes in the first place, and he attempted to show remorse and grief, like we heard last week. No matter how unconvincing it was, it shows that he knew it was wrong. The fact that he'd even think to fake emotion. And there were a few more details that came out during Fryerson's testimony that add to the full picture of this case.
Although Jones was making nearly $70,000 a year when his family moved to Lexington County when he began working at Intel, he picked a rundown mobile home out in the country to live in.
Yeah, he apparently wanted the space to have a farm with goats and chickens, which would be a really cool thing.
I do respect that.
Yeah, if you followed through, the kids would have fun with that. But instead, it just kind of made his family's living situation less comfortable than it could have been. There were 4 kids plus Amber when she was living with him, and then 5 kids after that. So you'd think it'd be pretty cramped in a mobile home.
Yeah, very tight. In 2012, when he separated from Amber and she began seeing the neighbor, Jones was apparently concerned that the neighbor's family was trying to prostitute her and would check the local prostitution websites for her.
Which, how do you even do that? He must have been on the dark web for that one. But I do see why he'd have these paranoid concerns, because remember his biological mom?
That is a good point.
Literally left him to become a prostitute.
Right.
So that's probably, that probably explains his paranoia about this.
Another detail was how young he was when he started using drugs. When he was just 12, he stole marijuana from his dad's stash and smoked it. And he had also been drinking alcohol heavily by the time he started high school.
Remember, again, 12 years old is when he said he started hearing voices. Just showing, again, the drug use really exacerbated his mental issues. No one should be using drugs at the age of 12, No one under 18 should be doing anything like this. But because the brain's still developing.
Right, you're just a sponge.
It doesn't affect your brain the same as when you're an adult. So, scary stuff. And, I mean, we see how, or what he did in the future. Looking back now, these little things, we can't ignore this stuff when we're thinking about what kind of effect they had on who he became in the future. But like we talked about earlier, he had a really rough childhood. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But what he did is so completely horrible, it kind of undoes any pity I personally would have had for him, you know?
Yeah.
We've talked about the cycle of abuse before. Just because someone has been abused in the past doesn't make it okay for them to abuse someone else. There's so many survivors out there who have lived through unimaginable things and have never gone on to harm anyone else. So even if all this stuff about his childhood is true, it's like, who cares at this point? You killed your kids. There's no possible excuse for that.
Right.
So I won't, advocate for him, but I do think it's important to consider the feelings of his ex-wife, the mother of these children.
Mm-hmm. I do too.
And the other family that had to lose these children.
Yeah, I think it's really strange that he got the death sentence with his family, not only his family, but his ex-wife, the mother of those children.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she should have a huge say in what happens to him. And she's had so much time to be level-headed and really consider what happened and what should happen and, get the help that she needed. I'm just surprised that they weren't more considerate of her.
Yeah. Oh, but again, the way this case was set up, it was either he's guilty or he's not guilty, and if he's found guilty, then the punishment is death. I guess maybe the jury can ask for leniency, I don't know, but I mean, they weren't going to say he's not guilty.
No, and I do think he deserves to die. It's a very tough situation. I'm glad I'm not on the jury.
Mm-hmm. But at least we can be aware of what this family's gone through and how difficult it is for them. Because when something happens like this and you're related to the person who did it, I can't imagine how much hate they get from people, misdirected anger, blaming them, or, just...
Right.
I hate seeing that when anger is misdirected. It happens so often. There are so many misunderstandings out there. People who didn't do anything getting blamed for other people's offenses, and it's wrong. It shouldn't happen, but it does all the time. And anyway, that's pretty much it for this case. At least our coverage of it. What do you think, Rosie?
Yikes. Well, okay, I just looked up the kids, and now I want him to die, because it's like...
Oh, I know.
You make that mental, emotional connection with a picture.
Well, I know. That beach video we talked about last week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, what
when
the
you
heck?
see the kids, see videos and pictures of the kids, then it's hard to feel for the family when they say they want mercy. But yeah, maybe we should post the kids on our Instagram.
Yeah, I think so.
We've been kind of bad about Instagram lately.
Oh, we have, haven't we?
Yeah.
Oops.
I think there was an update on another case we've covered, though. Oh, yeah.
Larry? Nassar?
Oh, you mean Yasser?
Yeah, sorry.
Yasser Saeed has been arrested.
Wow, I really missed. I'm surprised you got that out of that.
I want to thank... I don't even know how many people sent us the link to his arrest. Thank you all so much for that. It's really good news. Hopefully he'll finally get what he deserves for what he did to his kids.
Mm-hmm.
Or hopefully realize how terrible it is what he did. Because based on what he did, it's like he felt completely justified in doing it. So, anyway, this has been a really rough case.
Yeah.
It's such a downer.
It is a downer.
Which is the nature of true crime. But
yeah, it's true.
This one is especially... Anyone with kids in it is especially rough. But, all right. Well, thank you guys for listening. We are going to wrap things up on the main feed. And we're going to record our Patreon episode.
Yes, we are.
About scams.
With video.
Yeah.
Which means I'm going to go put on a different shirt and a glass of wine will be in my hand.
Oh, you're not going to wear your comfy sweater?
No. I've got sweatpants on. It's not a good look.
I like it. Cool. Well, thank you guys for listening. We hope you're all doing okay right now. It's, it's a struggle these days to try to stay positive with everything so weird. Mm-hmm. Not only is life not what it should be, not being able to do stuff, but there's so much unrest and injustice and violence and sickness. It's just crazy how much stuff's going on right now. So
it is.
We hope you're all safe and healthy. We'll let you go now and talk to you next week.
All right. Bye.